Jamie Cowan here, and I'm here today to talk to you about Perry Mason and the gospel. Wait, what? What does Perry Mason have to do with the gospel? I'll explain shortly. My generation remembers the original Perry Mason television show starring Raymond Burr. He was a clean-cut criminal defense lawyer who amazingly always represents the wrongly accused, exonerates them, and is able to implicate the real perpetrator. Wow! But anyone who does any kind of criminal defense work knows that often their clients are guilty of something, most cases are plea bargained, and rarely, if ever, is another person implicated, especially by the defense attorney. Actually, Yeshua the Messiah is a defense lawyer of sorts. In the Bible, in 1 John, it says, if anyone sins, we have an advocate, a lawyer, with the Father, Yeshua the Messiah the righteous. The difference between Perry Mason and Yeshua is that Perry Mason successfully defends the innocent, whereas Yeshua successfully defends the guilty. But that's another matter. That leads me to move to the actual lesson today. Now, you may not be aware, but there's actually a new Perry Mason television show on HBO, although it's quite different from the original. The new show is pretty dark and graphic. It takes place in the 1930s in Los Angeles during the Depression. Unlike the original, the new Perry Mason is unshaven, an alcoholic, kind of a bum, who apparently suffers from PTSD due to military service in France during World War I. But like the earlier Perry Masons, the story is about a murder. In this case, it's a murder of a baby, and the parents are accused by the police. Perry Mason and his team represent the parents. Now you're probably wondering, why am I talking about Perry Mason, and what does that have to do with the gospel? Well, as it turns out, in the show, the baby's parents attend a large church in Los Angeles that's led by someone called Sister Alice. Now, as soon as we watched the first episode, I knew that Sister Alice had to be a takeoff on Aimee Semple Mcpherson, an evangelist and pastor of the huge Angelus Temple in Los Angeles from the 1920s to the 1940s. As depicted in the show, there is quite the contrast between the brooding yet good-intentioned Perry Mason and the charismatic and deeply religious Sister Alice. It makes for a compelling story, but her ministry is what captured my attention. Now, I knew a little bit about her before. I knew she was Pentecostal, was a faith healer, and was controversial for a variety of factors. But I decided to research her, and all I can say is, wow, we've got a lot to learn from her. It's particularly relevant because she ministered during the last great crises of the United States, the Great Depression and World War II. She preached a gospel of inclusion, not exclusion. And while she was involved for a while in the political controversy of teaching evolution in the schools, she was against her, her main focuses were preaching the gospel to all and ministering to the downtrodden. Let me give you a quick overview. She was born in the late 19th century in Canada to a strong Christian family. She began to question her faith during her teen years until she showed up at a Pentecostal revival meeting. God deeply touched her, and from then on she was committed to share the good news of Jesus the Messiah to all. She married a Pentecostal minister, and together they left for China to be missionaries. After a few months, her husband tragically died from malaria, and she returned to the United States penniless and pregnant. She married an accountant, but became increasingly bored and depressed. She felt she was denying her calling to preach the gospel, so she left her husband and brought her children with her as she began preaching in open-air venues. Her husband later joined her, but eventually divorced her because he didn't like the itinerant preacher lifestyle. With her plain speaking, personal stories, and her sharing the love of God, she became increasingly popular. She traveled the country preaching to increasingly large crowds. When she preached in the South, she insisted that the services be racially integrated. In 1917, she moved to Los Angeles just as Hollywood was coming into its own. She was able to meld the theatrics of Hollywood with the clear gospel message. She built the largest church in the United States, the country's first megachurch. Numerous Hollywood stars attended her church and participated in biblical plays performed at the church. She organized her own radio network and was the first woman preacher on the radio. She sponsored numerous branches of her ministry around the country. In its first 7 years of existence, the church in Los Angeles received 40 million visitors. Through that church, she spearheaded huge charitable and social works for the poor, for illegal immigrants, the African American communities, humanitarian relief for natural disasters. She created soup kitchens and the health clinics during the Depression, and the church took over failed government programs. All the while, holding multiple services during the week in which thousands attended each service, where she preached constantly. She often invited African American ministers to preach in her church. She finally died in 1944 from an accidental overdose of sleeping medications. By the 1940s, it was said that about 10% of the population of Los Angeles were members of her church. Now, why am I talking about her? First, it's an encouragement that anyone from any background can be used of God to impact the world. Consider that she was the most popular evangelist in the country when women were essentially second-class citizens, and who during this period had just received the right to vote. Not only that, she was essentially a single parent for much of her early ministry. Second, during this day and age, when the gospel has become so intertwined with culture wars and politics, that's refreshing that she used her prominent platform to preach a bold gospel message and show by example what faith in God does for others by doing everything that she could to minister to the downtrodden. As I've said in previous messages, the amalgamation of faith and politics in our day has contaminated the gospel. Consider Yeshua's words, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's." Or as he said earlier, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the peacemakers." Now contrast these words with faith leaders who are photographed parading themselves into the Oval Office, supporting politicians whose lives are antithetical to the gospel and who are manipulated by those very same politicians. To conclude with Aimee Semple Mcpherson, though she was the most popular minister of her time, she built the country's largest church, whose ministry holdings were in the millions of dollars. When she died, she left an inheritance of just $10,000. The massive amounts of money that she raised was spent on the work of God and others, and not for herself. According to the author who created the original fictional Perry Mason in books, he depicts Perry Mason as a lawyer who fights hard on behalf of his clients and who enjoys the unusual, difficult, or nearly helpless cases. Aimee Semple Mcpherson depicted God as one who reaches out and transforms those unusual, difficult, and seemingly hopeless people. May we all know that God and depict him in exactly that way. Thank you, and see you next time.